We must uphold the values of our nation and work together for a brighter future.
Ouagadougou, early morning. The city hums under a rising Sahel sun, its streets alive with the pulse of another working day. From above, a drone sweeps over the ochre rooftops and busy markets, before diving toward the presidential office, a stark white building where history, on this day, is about to turn. Inside, President Ibrahim Traoré sits at his desk, reviewing security briefings, when an aide steps in, his face unreadable. In his hand an envelope, heavy, sealed, and stamped in bold red, confidential diplomatic correspondence. The air seems to thicken. Cameras would later describe how Traoré's fingers paused for a heartbeat before breaking the seal. Inside was a letter that, within hours, would ripple across the continent. The words on that page were not mere diplomacy, they were an offer, or perhaps a test. Israel was proposing $1.2 billion. For context, that's more than Burkina Faso's entire national budget. But this was not a gift, not an act of solidarity. It came tethered to conditions political, economic, and deeply strategic. A request to temper criticism, to shift alliances, to become, in effect, a voice not of the Burkinabe people, but of another government's interests. In legal terms, it was an attempt to reshape national policy through monetary leverage. In human terms, it was an invitation to trade principle for cash. Outside, Ouagadougou moved as if nothing had happened. But inside that office, the weight of the decision was enough to shift Africa's political gravity. Because this was not just about one man, one country, or one deal. It was about whether the independence so fiercely declared could be bought, or if it was, at last, truly beyond price. The question was clear. What would he do next? He read the letter once, twice, and then a third time, as if repetition might dull the sting. It didn't. Each line only sharpened his anger. The words were draped in diplomatic courtesy, but beneath them lay an unmistakable message. Your sovereignty has a price tag. For President Ibrahim Traoré, that was more than an insult, it was a direct challenge to the principles that had carried him into office. He did not endure political storms, stand against military pressure, and restructure an entire nation's governance, just to become, in his own words, a decorated puppet in someone else's theater. In legal language, it was an offer conditioned on political realignment, a classic case of quid pro quo in international relations. In human terms, it was a reminder that in the global order, money is often a tool of influence, disguised as generosity. The sum was tempting. Yes, $1.2 billion could transform infrastructure, fund hospitals, and modernize entire sectors overnight. But Traoré's revolution was never built on quick transactions. It was built on reclaiming the right to decide, without external strings. For him, sovereignty wasn't a ceremonial phrase in a constitution. It was a living mandate: economic independence that meant rejecting aid designed to dictate policy, political independence that meant speaking freely in global forums, and strategic independence that meant charting a course even when it defied powerful allies. The letter had crossed a line. And in that moment, sitting in Ouagadougou's presidential office under the unrelenting Sahel sun, Traoré knew one thing. This was not just an opportunity to refuse, it was a moment to set a precedent. The question now was clear, and it was no longer his alone. Would Africa continue to trade its voice for a check, or was it ready to write its own terms? It wasn't just the letter. Within days, a quiet parade of friendly advisors began arriving in Ouagadougou, emissaries without official titles, envoys without formal agendas. Some came from neighboring capitals, others from partner states with long histories of balancing between Africa and the West. They spoke in careful tones, offering visions of highways carved across the Sahel, hospitals gleaming with imported equipment, and military modernization programs ready to deploy. The subtext was unmistakable. All of this in exchange for silence. In diplomatic practice, this is known as soft conditionality, aid and investment, structured not through written clauses, but through implied obligations. To the public, it looks like cooperation. Behind closed doors, it's a calibrated attempt to shape policy without a single vote cast. For President Traoré, the pattern was clear: a network of influence operating across borders, leveraging promises as currency. He had seen it before in other African capitals, where short-term gains often came at the cost of long-term autonomy. The more they spoke, the clearer his path became. On a hot Thursday morning in Ouagadougou, he broke from the script most leaders follow. No discreet negotiations, no quiet refusal. Instead, he called for a live press conference, inviting local and international media. Under the glare of television lights, with Pan-African flags at his back, he unfolded the very letter, every word, every figure, and read it aloud for all of Africa to hear. It was a calculated inversion of the game, turning a private bargain into a public trial. The question hanging in the air was no longer whether he would accept the offer, but whether any leader could, after this, justify saying yes. And in that moment, one had to wonder, had he just shifted the terms of power in Africa's favor? The moment President Ibrahim Traoré's voice carried those final words across the press room, they thought dignity had a price, but today we prove them wrong. Something shifted far beyond the walls of Ouagadougou. Within hours, clips of the broadcast flooded social media feeds across the continent. By nightfall, the hashtag number Africa Not For Sale was trending in 14 countries, from Cape Town to Cairo. The message was no longer just Burkina Faso's lock. It had become a rallying cry for an entire generation. In Bamako, youth groups marched through the streets carrying banners, with the quote printed in bold. In Niamey, student unions organized public forums, dissecting the meaning of sovereignty in a global economy. Chad's national television aired panel debates on whether foreign aid could ever truly be free of hidden obligations. Ghana's parliament saw opposition and ruling members alike pushing for stricter transparency laws on foreign contracts. And in South Africa, civil society coalitions issued statements demanding that all government negotiations with external powers be made public. Political scientists described it as a normative cascade, when one act of defiance reframes the moral boundaries of an entire region. For the youth, it became something more visceral. They called themselves the No-Compromise Generation, an informal but rapidly growing movement, demanding that African leaders publish the terms of every foreign agreement. Their manifesto was simple: if it is done in our name, we have the right to know. The speed of the reaction caught even seasoned diplomats off guard. What was intended as a private transaction between two governments had turned into a continental referendum on dignity, independence, and the politics of influence. In cafes, classrooms, and crowded bus stations, people were asking the same question. If Burkina Faso could reject billions to keep its voice, why couldn't others? And yet, as the movement swelled, so did the stakes. In capitals where leaders were accustomed to quiet deals and controlled narratives, the pressure was now public, visible, and impossible to ignore. The question was no longer whether Africa had awakened, it was whether its leaders were ready to act in daylight, and if they weren't, how long before the streets demanded they do. In Tel Aviv, the reaction was immediate and tense. The broadcast from Ouagadougou had not just rejected a diplomatic overture, it had made the offer itself a matter of public record, stripping away the discretion that statecraft often relies on. Within hours, senior advisors were in closed-door meetings, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was, according to sources in the Knesset, visibly angered. What was meant to be a quiet maneuver had turned into a visible crack in Israel's influence strategy in parts of Africa. Paris and Washington moved more cautiously. Analysts in the Quai d'Orsay and the US State Department pored over transcripts, assessing whether Traoré's defiance might inspire similar stances elsewhere. Both capitals understood the deeper implication. If one leader could turn down such a substantial sum while rallying public opinion, the cost of influence in Africa might be rising beyond money's reach. Meanwhile, in Beijing, the official response was silence, but not inaction. Chinese diplomatic observers noted the shift without public comment, aware that the geopolitical calculus in Africa was quietly being rewritten. In his follow-up address from the presidential palace, Traoré distilled the moment into one line: "The old playbook no longer works. You cannot buy or divide us with secret contracts." For him, this was not just a rebuttal to a single proposal, but a declaration aimed at every capital that still believed influence could be secured behind closed doors. The statement resonated beyond its immediate audience, forcing foreign ministries to consider whether their traditional engagement models were now liabilities. The diplomatic ripples spread quickly. Ambassadors requested clarifications, policy think tanks issued urgent memos, and African embassies abroad reported an uptick in media inquiries about sovereignty, transparency, and the ethics of foreign aid. What had begun as a political transaction had escalated into a case study in public diplomacy, one that other nations would be hard-pressed to ignore. And yet, with the dust far from settled, a larger question loomed. If the quiet language of deals is giving way to the loud demands of public accountability, how many nations are truly ready to negotiate in the open? The backlash against Traoré's refusal did not take long to materialize. Within 2 weeks, Burkina Faso began to feel the squeeze. Delayed payments on existing aid packages, unexplained technical issues, holding up trade clearances, and a noticeable tightening of credit from certain international banks. For a landlocked nation still rebuilding its economic base, these were more than bureaucratic inconveniences. They were pressure points, applied with precision. Yet instead of retreating, something remarkable happened. Africa started to close ranks. From Abuja came the first lifeline. Nigeria announced it would open new trade corridors with Burkina Faso, fast-tracking agricultural exports and reducing tariffs on key commodities. In Accra, Ghana's finance ministry confirmed a short-term liquidity facility, giving Ouagadougou breathing room to keep essential programs running. And in Pretoria, South Africa leveraged its diplomatic reach to open new negotiation channels for Burkina Faso, with partners in Asia and Latin America, effectively bypassing traditional gatekeepers. What emerged was not charity, but a coordinated assertion that African nations could stabilize each other without waiting for external approval. At a joint press briefing in Ouagadougou, Traoré unveiled what he called the 5-point sovereignty plan. First, audit every major contract signed in the last 20 years to ensure compliance with national interest and transparency standards. Second, expand intra-African trade under the African Continental Free Trade Area, prioritizing goods and services that keep value within the continent. Third, shift from raw export to local production, building processing facilities for gold, cotton, and agricultural products. Fourth, create a Pan-African investment bank capitalized by member states and private African investors to finance infrastructure without external debt traps. And fifth, invest heavily in technology, education, and healthcare infrastructure, positioning these sectors as both economic drivers and safeguards against dependency. Each point was both practical and political, a roadmap to resilience, and a signal to the world that Africa's future would be negotiated on its own terms. The plan drew on legal frameworks from the African Union's Agenda 2063, but Traoré's framing was more immediate. We are not building for 2063. We are building for now, because our children cannot wait. The energy was contagious. Civil society groups across West and Southern Africa began hosting public forums on how to adapt the 5-point plan to their own countries. University students debated the legal mechanics of a continental investment bank. Even in markets and bus stations, traders talked about processing cocoa in Abidjan or refining gold in Ouagadougou instead of shipping it unprocessed overseas. It was a vision rooted not in isolation, but in interdependence, the kind chosen freely, not imposed through conditional agreements. And as the first trucks rolled from Nigeria into Burkina Faso under the new trade corridor, the question was already forming in the minds of many. If Africa can hold itself up when the world tries to push it down, what else might be possible when it decides to rise together? The tension inside Burkina Faso's cabinet room was palpable. Some ministers spoke in cautious tones, warning of the risks trade, retaliation, suspended aid, even diplomatic isolation. But President Ibrahim Traoré was unmoved. Aid with conditions, he said firmly, is not aid, it is control. And control is not compatible with sovereignty. His words hung in the air like a gavel strike, signaling not just a decision, but a doctrine. In the days that followed, his phone lit up with calls from across the continent. 5 African heads of state reached out, not to scold, but to inquire. They wanted to know the formula, how to refuse an offer of such magnitude and emerge politically stronger. Traoré's answer was deceptively simple. Make the refusal public, root it in principle, and ensure that your people understand exactly why you said no. In his view, transparency was not a defensive tactic, it was a strategic weapon. Meanwhile, foreign business circles began to take notice. In Johannesburg, mining sector analysts reported jittery investor sentiment, while in London and Paris, certain commodity-linked stocks dipped, reflecting uncertainty about future access to African markets. But Traoré was quick to draw a distinction. Speaking at a regional economic forum in Bobo-Dioulasso, he declared, "Burkina Faso is not against business, we are against exploitation. If you respect our labor laws, environmental standards, and tax obligations, you will find our doors open." It was a message that resonated beyond the hall, carried by journalists into boardrooms and trading floors worldwide. From a legal standpoint, what Traoré was doing was redefining the framework of bilateral engagement, shifting from dependency-based agreements toward partnership-based contracts. In practical terms, it meant that foreign companies could no longer rely on political favoritism or discreet concessions. They would have to compete on fair terms, with the public eye watching. This recalibration unsettled some, but attracted others, particularly firms in Asia and Latin America, eager to enter African markets under clear, predictable rules. Diplomats in Ouagadougou noted the subtle change in tone from certain capitals, where once the language was about supporting development, it now leaned toward mutual opportunity. It was more than semantics. It was an acknowledgement that the balance of leverage had shifted, however slightly, in Africa's favor. Still, the path ahead was uncertain. Rewriting the rules of engagement would inevitably provoke resistance from those invested in the old ways. But Traoré seemed ready for the pushback, framing it as part of the continent's larger political evolution. "Our dignity," he reminded his audience, "is not negotiable, and if it takes 1,000 small acts of defiance to make that clear, then so be it." The question now was whether this stance could survive the storms to come, and whether other nations were ready to anchor themselves to the same uncompromising principle. Could Africa truly sustain a new era of relations on its own terms, or would the pull of old dependencies prove too strong? The weeks that followed felt less like an ending and more like a wave that refused to recede. Across Burkina Faso, ministries began opening dusty filing cabinets, pulling out old contracts, and subjecting them to unprecedented scrutiny. Agreements that had once been treated as untouchable were now on the table line by line, clause by clause. In Ouagadougou's industrial district, workers in the textile sector stood alongside their union leaders, demanding not just better wages, but stronger clauses on safety and job security. In the mining regions, cooperatives sought guarantees that a larger share of profits would stay in local communities. Civil society groups, often sidelined in the past, published transparency reports, translating legal jargon into language anyone could understand. Meanwhile, something more profound was happening beneath the surface. In the courtyards of universities, on the workbenches of small tech hubs, in the open-air markets where goods are bartered and sold, young people were sketching out their own blueprints for the future. A group of engineering students in Kodougou developed low-cost solar irrigation systems using locally sourced parts. A collective of artists in Bobo-Dioulasso launched a series of public murals celebrating African heritage, transforming walls into lessons of history and pride. Small manufacturers began experimenting with local cotton blends, aiming to replace imports with homegrown fabrics. This wasn't about rejecting the outside world, it was about entering it on equal terms, standing at the table as partners, not as clients. The sense of agency was palpable, and it carried with it a quiet, unshakable confidence. Change didn't have to be spectacular to be irreversible. Then came Traoré's closing words, delivered on a warm evening to a crowd gathered in the capital's central square. His voice was steady, but it carried the weight of months of confrontation and resolve. They came to buy a president. Instead, they awakened 1.4 billion Africans. This revolution continues not with guns, but with dignity and truth. The applause rolled like distant thunder, not just in Burkina Faso, but wherever the speech was streamed or replayed. In that moment, the story was no longer only about one leader's decision. It was about a continent, slowly realizing that its worth could not be calculated in the language of bids and contracts. It was about a generation claiming ownership of their narrative through technology, through industry, through art. The cameras panned over the crowd, catching the faces of young and old, traders and students, farmers and factory workers. They were not just witnesses to an event, they were participants in a movement. And as the lights dimmed and the square began to empty, one question lingered in the air, not as doubt, but as a challenge. If dignity and truth can rewrite the terms once, how many more times can they reshape the future? If this story stirred something in you, save it, share it, and join the conversation. The revolution is not a single moment, it's what happens next.